Wednesday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us. Everyone in.
Hey, welcome along. So we have much to discuss. Obviously, Ireland-France at the weekend, with Ireland to play Italy this weekend and to decide who finishes third in the Six Nations behind England and France. We have the Rainbow Cup, which has lost the South African teams, and that really was the whole point. It's now a very weird post-season repeat of the Pro 14 without any of the prestige. Leinster, Munster at the weekend, Ulster, Connacht this weekend as well, and on we'll go. Rory O'Connor of the Irish Independent is with us. How you doing?
Hey Joe, good, thanks.
Tell you what, World of Football been interesting this week. They make CVC look like philanthropic, generous wonder people.
Yeah, it's been quite something, hasn't it? It makes you question whether the people running elite sports, in particular football, I suppose, are as clever as we all thought they were, and whether the people who are advising them are worth the money they're paid. It's been incredible, and like rugby's a sport in a very high degree of flux with private investment coming in across the board, and you know, it's a very different situation. It's a much smaller sport with much different demands, and I actually think a European Super League in rugby would be a great idea for Irish rugby in the four provinces, because, to be honest, it's better than what we have at the moment. But yeah, it's been a pretty chastening few days for the people running football, and I think it's a reminder of how powerful fans can be, which I think rugby fans can take heed of as well, is that if they have strong opinions on things, they can actually have a say, which maybe they didn't realise they had. I
hate to break it here, our digital department now will have Rory O'Connor support Super League, European Super League. We'll leave out the rugby. We'll leave out the rugby.
It's a headline in today, so I've let down my colours to the mast. But I mean, as much as I love the Rainbow Cup, I would love to be covering Leinster, La Rochelle, followed by Munster, Leicester Tigers, and Ulster, Toulouse on a weekly basis. I think we'd have much more interesting chats on a weekly basis, and people, and it would all be in one broadcaster, because rugby's big problem is it's spread across with 6 broadcasters, and it's costing people a lot of money.
Yeah, fair point. So look, a few bits going on. The Tadhg Furlong contract situation, you might clear up for us. Firstly, due to expire this summer, I know Leo Cullen was asked yesterday why it hadn't been signed yet. Leinster very good often at releasing on a certain day. We've just signed, 25 extensions. Yeah. So, and then obviously they signed Michael Alala-Toa, tight head. So I think a couple of Leinster fans, and I guess Irish fans as well, were into worrying 2+2 territory.
Yeah, well, Tadhg Furlong's contract wouldn't be released by Leinster. It's the IRFU do their own contracts, and they would release them under the IRFU steam. So they wouldn't normally come in that. I mean, this year they did it one by one over the course of a week to try and generate some social media interest, I think. But Tadhg Furlong would have been released during the Six Nations, along with Peter O'Mahony, Keith Earls, Johnny Sexton, Ian Henderson, Cian Healy, who were all out, and then obviously CJ Stander we all expected, and then he retired. Now I'm not expecting Tadhg Furlong to step away from the game, and there's absolutely no murmurings that he's going elsewhere in the ether, and it would be unusual for a contract situation to get to this point in April and not have any rumour that he's going somewhere else. I don't have any great insight beyond the assumption from talking to people within the game that there's basically haggling over the finer details of it. He's too valuable to Irish rugby. I think he said in an interview, I think it was during the Six Nations, that he's never really, maybe that was Ian Henderson, but I don't think he's looked elsewhere at this stage of his career. I think this is his big contract, I suppose. What is he, 27 now? So this is the kind of, I know he can go on longer, tight end props can play till I know a ripe old age. They're not under the same pressure as other positions. But this is an important contract in his career. I guess the RFU are trying to cut their cloth elsewhere. I mean, the fact that CJ Sanders' retirement freed up a little bit of budget, I'm sure it wouldn't have gone unnoticed for Tadhg Furlong and his agent, and they may have gone to look for it. And he's in a position where he would walk into any club in Europe who's looking for a world-class tight head prop. Japan as well. I mean, there's a good market there for players, and he's got a profile. He's a lion. He's first name in the Irish team sheet when he's fit, and he knows his value. And I'd say he's just told that. I was surprised by the CJ Sanders story. Things are not coming out as much as they may be used to. But with a contract story like this, particularly when you think France will be the likely destination for a player of Furlong's calibre, I think we would have heard murmurings. The Alatoa thing, I don't think is a direct correlation. I think he's there to cover him and Andrew Porter. Michael Bent is going to retire at the end of the season. I think that's almost certain. And he's there as a replacement for Michael Bent and maybe to facilitate Andrew Porter moving across the scrum at various times. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about Tadhg Furlong. At the same time, it is April 21st. Sorry, I keep looking at my screen just to check the date. It's quite late in the day for signing up your most important player. So, you'd like to have it nailed down from an Irish rugby point of view going into the next 2 years of the World Cup cycle.
You mentioned there Andrew Porter switching across. The depth chart there at Loosehead in Irish rugby.
Not great. Cian Healy, I think, is 34 now, maybe 33, 34. I think there's been a decline in what he's been able to do around the pitch, albeit he's been quite good recently. I think the Saracens game was quite a difficult day for him, and I think it took him a while to recover. But, he's a massive injury profile over the years, an incredible longevity, one of the best players ever to have played for Ireland, never mind in his own position. But he's coming towards the end, and I think Jack McGrath gave Ireland huge comfort there. He's off to get his hip resurfaced in a similar way to Sean O'Brien did. He's had this troublesome hip injury since he was fairly flogged during Cian Healy's injury problems. Like, he was putting in 70, 80-minute performances for Ireland and Leinster on a weekly basis. Going to Ulster hasn't really revived his career in the way that maybe some would have hoped. And below that, you've got Dave Kilcoyne's 31, very good player. James Cronin is kind of first, second choice at Munster, but he doesn't seem to be the Ireland look-in. And last I heard, he hadn't been offered a new Munster contract, so he may be heading elsewhere. You've Ed Byrne at Leinster, good player, maybe not as big as the other guys who are in there, but a decent ball player. Eric O'Sullivan got a cap last year, but not maybe at the level yet. And there's a few young guys at Leinster that they rate, but there's no one really there to take the Cian Healy mantle. And when you think that Andrew Porter is not going to start for Leinster when Tadhg Furlong's fit, but he's good enough to start at pretty much every club in Europe. He's incredibly powerful. He's a brilliant ball carrier. And he came through as a loosehead in the first place. They must be looking at it going, well, how do we get the two of them into the same team alongside Ronan Kelleher in what could be the most dynamic front row you've ever seen in an Irish team? And there's definitely a temptation to do it. He came on, he covered Loosehead at the World Cup, and before the World Cup, he came off the bench at Loosehead against Wales in a World Cup qualifier, and he basically ended the Welsh Tightheads World Cup hopes. He destroyed them in the scrum, but it also frees him to do more around the park, where he's very, very good, because it doesn't sap your legs as much playing at Loosehead. It's not as demanding a position in terms of the scrummaging. So I think there's massive upside. I know Neil Tracy in Off the Ball disagrees with me. We've had a debate about it before. And a couple of people say, look, he's got to this level of tight, good. But when you've got a few decent tight head options coming through, I think there's definite potential in moving him across. And it will give Ireland and Leinster an incredibly powerful and dynamic front row for even better than what they have at the moment. And I think it's definitely worth looking at. And Alatoa, it gives you the quality of tight head backup that you have the comfort to even try it for 10 games next season. And if it doesn't work out, cool, move him back. He's a very good tight head prop.
And Rory, what would be the strongest argument against moving Porter back to Openside?
You've invested this much in him. You've got a backup to, like, Tadhg Furlong's going to come off after 50 minutes of nearly every game, because that's what happens with tight heads in the modern game. And you've got someone who's almost as good, sometimes has his own attributes. Like, he's probably a better breakdown threat than Tadhg Furlong. He's not as good a passer. He's incredible. He's got incredible strength. He's a brilliant collision winner. So he can come on and do a job, and he's proven it. He's gone to a World Cup before. He's made that switch successfully already, and will have an excellent career. And from him, he's looking at it going, well, tight head props make more money than loosehead props. Tight head props, he's already the number 2 in Ireland who gets his fair share of minutes. Tadhg Furlong has had a year out with injury that made, that he's looking at that going, and Forder did a really good job while Furlong was injured. He'd be looking at that going, maybe there's a chance there to play more as well. So for him, there's a risk probably going back to loosehead, but I think it's a risk he'd be willing to try for a while.
Okay, I think my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you went and came back there.
Okay,
you're back now.
Good. We'll press on. Apologies. The Rainbow Cup. We loved you all too briefly. It's the European Super League of rugby.
The 2 Rainbow Cups. It's so good. There's going to be 2 running concurrently in different hemispheres. I mean, you don't want to be too cynical. I think there's a natural tendency when you're a journalist to be quite cynical, and you don't want to be down on everything. But when this thing was announced at the height of a global pandemic, that you were going to try and pull off a tournament that crosses the hemispheres in the height of this situation that we're in, it always looked like a massive ask to try and logistically come together and play, add an extra team and an extra health jurisdiction to from a country that with massive disparities in wealth and huge problems in terms of the way they're managing the pandemic. Their numbers are off the chart. It's all about money, it's all about getting the 6 million that the South Africans have committed as part of their commitment to join the Pro 16, as it will become, includes a payment of 6 million a season. And the Irish, Welsh, Scots and Italians wanted that money, and they're going to get it because somehow the South Africans are going to pay to run their own tournament. I think it's probably been worked out in the last while, but they're going to get basically the provinces will get 500 grand each for this tournament. And to do and for that 500 grand, they have sacrificed Pro 14 and their knockouts, and instead they're going to run this tournament that doesn't really make any sense on a whole number of levels. It's 6 rounds, 3 of which we know about are going to be interpros here, Welsh derbies in Wales, Scots are playing the Italians, and then I presume we will then have games against the Welsh and the Scots and the Italians, although with mandatory quarantine and Italy, that poses a whole problem there. And then after your 6 rounds against a random set of opponents, there's a final between the top 2 teams of that 12. So it's imperfect, to say the very least. It's hard to sell it, I think, and it doesn't have a website. So if you want to know what the fixtures are, you don't even know where to go for it. Look, 500 grand probably pays for the provincial academies, or certainly the players in the provincial academies. It's important to get that money in, and I think, with there's no crowds at games and all the things we know about, it's really important to get the money in, but it's come at a bit of a price. It's just great that Leinster and Ulster are still in Europe, and there's a Lions tour to talk about, because if we were hanging our hat on this, and broadcasters are, the ones who've paid for this tournament are trying to sell it, and they'll do a good job at it, but it's going to be a tough sell. And if Munster win it, for example, and it's CJ Stander's last act is to lift this trophy, I think it will mean something to them, but it's not the same as winning a Pro 14. And even the Pro 14 itself is a bit of a hard sell at times, but it's another step down, I think, from that, even though the provinces are going full on for it, and I'm sure the Welsh and Scots are as well.
So would we have any inkling, for instance, how Leinster and Munster are approaching this Saturday?
I would say Munster will go full strength, because they've no game the following week, and they could do it beating Leinster, and they could do it a third trophy, and they want to carry some momentum out of the season. Basically, Leo Cullen said the other day that they have a couple of seriously heavy hitters coming back from injury who they want to get back in ahead of La Rochelle. They have a couple of players who have high mileage on the clock from Ireland who they'll probably rest. Pretty similar to the Pro 14 final. I'd say you're going to see James Ryan, Gary Ringrose, Will Connors, Caelan Doris, maybe 3 of those 4 will come back into it. You're going to see someone like Ross Byrne will be starting at 10, I would presume, because Johnny Sexton's out injured. They used to be stood down with concussion. And you'll probably have a mix and match of the starters and the bench players from next week. But Leinster have a massive game in 8 days' time after it. They need, a good hit out against Munster will serve them very well as well. So I think it'll be a good game. I think these games have been good. It's just diminished a little bit, a lot by the fact that it's not building towards the proper knockouts of the Pro 14 season as they would normally be. Yeah,
it's a very strange postseason, isn't it? I mean, I guess in terms of long-term damage to the Pro 14 brand, it's not disastrous, because the Pro 16 will come into existence next year with the South Africans, and so there'll be excitement about that. But in terms of what it did to the Pro 14 season just gone, I mean, really it showed scant regard or respect for the tournament. I mean, it was curtailed completely. The quarterfinals abandoned. The number of teams who could therefore progress to the knockout stages abandoned. Therefore, lots of matches were either dead rubbers or didn't happen at all. You squeeze in your showpiece, Munster-Leinster, the week after Six Nations, and then the week before European action. So we weren't even sure would they be able to play their strongest teams. I mean, it's a much derided tournament from the outside. I mean, they as I said, they show scant regard for it from within this season. I mean, and all on a wing and a prayer that somehow there would be hemisphere to hemisphere travel in the midst of this pandemic. I mean, you don't have to dwell on it because, like I said, next year it's all forgotten and the South Africans are on board and it's a bright new future. But I think it puts a little bit of an exclamation point after how a lot of people feel about the Pro 14, maybe the Pro 14 included.
Yeah, I mean, it's an easy tournament to kick, and that's what I was kind of saying earlier. Like, don't want to be overly down on it all the time, but there was only 12 teams in the Pro 14 this year, which is an interesting starting point. They still had 2 conferences, which didn't really make sense. Ulster finished on the same amount of points as Munster after the same amount of games, but lost out on points difference to a final. I mean, they could be very hard done by that. They didn't get a quarter-final and a semi-final. Everyone played different teams. It was uneven. From a sporting integrity point of view, there's definitely questions. And the thing is, no one kicked up a fuss because no one really cares about it that much.
Look, there is a truth. We didn't get one text in saying, geez, lads, the Pro 14, the integrity of it, I'm not sure. No,
I mean, it was during the Six Nations. Everyone's wrapped up in that. And that's where it sits in the tier. And that's why I was kind of saying that, a European Super League for rugby would be fantastic, because you would care about it. Something that people would latch onto, because really, in these weeks, and it's Leinster-Munster this week, it's the 5th Leinster-Munster game since rugby came back, and it's been a long season. Rugby came back on August 22nd and it's still going. They had to finish last season and this season. There is a certain level of fatigue out there anyway, but the Pro 14 doesn't do itself a lot of favours sometimes. But I do think the Pro 16 will be better, and I do think there is a general acknowledgement out there that things are difficult at the moment for people trying to run sporting competitions, and particularly an international sporting competition like this. And people have a little bit of forgiveness, but also people aren't invested in it as much as they are in the European Cup or the Six Nations or other rugby tournaments. And that's something that those organisers are going to have to deal with. And that's the great challenge of it, because really, who in Ireland really is going to be watching Ospreys? And I don't even know which Welsh teams are playing this week, and I'm the rugby correspondent. Maybe that's a bad reflection of me. I know which South African teams are playing or are supposed to be playing, but who's really going to be tuning in watching Ospreys Dragons this weekend? Whereas if you're watching the Premier League, you generally keep an eye on, you watch Match of the Day because you want to know, you have an interest in who in everyone, even if you're just a Liverpool fan. Yeah, the lack of outcry is telling. I do wonder, maybe with the Pro 14, a really good highlights show a la Match of the Day might go a long way to keep you in touch with what's happening with the Welsh regions or the Scottish teams, and then down in South Africa, There is a good highlight show. I think it's on Wednesday nights on Air Sports, but it's on air, and a lot of people don't have Air Sport. And there's a lot of other stuff going on. There's live Premier League pretty much every night of the week. If there's not live Premier League, there's Champions League. I mean, I was watching League of Ireland last night. There's rugby from basically Friday at 6 o'clock until Sunday night on Champions Cup weekends. I mean, it's hard to keep up with live sport at the moment, even if you're really invested in it. So I think they could probably, their social media presence is quite good. The highlights packages are all up there on YouTube. They're 5 minutes. They're quite decent. It's all there, but there's so much going on at the moment. The transient sports fan, the person who loves the Premier League and has a passing interest in rugby, or likes the Champions Cup, they just don't have, there's limited attention spans for everything now. And I think the football conversation probably shows that a little bit.
So do you think, as a final point, and what you say about how difficult life is at the moment to organise anything is a fair one, in fairness to the organisers? I didn't realise they were still going to get, this chunk of change. Do you think they said, well, look, worst case scenario, it's a bonus 500 grand, so even though it's unlikely, let's just ignite the Rainbow Cup here?
Well, I think they did it. They did everything they could to try and make it happen. I think, Peter O'Reilly had a piece on Sunday that said they were looking at basing themselves in Croatia for 2 weeks because they didn't have the mandatory quarantine. It's basically look at every way they could do it, whether they stationed themselves in Jersey for 2 weeks to quarantine and then play based in Europe. And eventually they just couldn't get the clearance from governments. So I think it's really important to the Pro 14 organisers and to the Irish provinces in particular to get these South African teams in, because I think they think it will make the tournament way more relevant. I mean, there's 1 million South Africans in London, or at least there was last time I heard that stat thrown out. It's a massive market. They're good teams. Not all of them. They're not as good. They're not all as good as each other. But there are really good teams who will challenge the Irish provinces in a really different way, and will prepare players to play international and European rugby. They will bring income. They will eventually, maybe even as quick as the season after next, they'll play in the Champions Cup. They'll make life more difficult to win, but they'll make it more challenging and more entertaining and make the games more relevant. I think strategically it was really important to not abandon the South Africans from a Pro 14 point of view, because they bring so much to the table, albeit they're in a different continent, and it's going to make life a little bit more challenging in terms of logistics and that sort of thing. So, in the absence of the English and the French ever wanting Ireland and Wales to join their leagues, which isn't going to happen anytime soon. It is quite important from Irish rugby point of view to keep them on side, and that money can't be snipped. Like it's a drop in the ocean for the Super League clubs, but it's like 500 grand will go a long way in each of the Irish provinces this year.
Yeah. One last point on then the action at the weekend, which gets underway, as we said, on Friday. It is Ulster Connacht, 8:15 on Friday.
Yeah.
And then Saturday we have Leinster against Munster. A couple of new laws being trialled. There are a few interesting ones. The red card means 20 minutes down to 14 men, then a replacement, for instance, the captain's challenge. And then if tries are held up, there's a change there. What's catching your eye?
Well, the red card one is interesting. I mean, the black card has obviously been brought mixed reviews in the GA world. It's now sin bin, isn't it? But it was it's basically like people fear that a red card, especially if you're, say, Peter O'Mahony in the 20th minute against Wales, it basically turns the tournament, the contest upside down and unbalances it unfairly. And often a high tackle or a head collision is accidental, that the player just gets it wrong, and it's not the same as decking someone, which is what the red card was probably designed for initially. So what they've tried to do is punish the team and punish the player, because he can't come back on, but you can bring on a replacement for after that 20-minute period. I think within New Zealand, it's been trialled in New Zealand already, and because Super Rugby isn't on Sky at the moment, I haven't been able to watch as much of it as I previously would have. Teams have dealt quite well with being down to 14 men for 20 minutes, and it hasn't really punished the team that's got a man sent off. And I think there is a fear that it would diminish or would make it less of a risk to go high, and commit those offences that they're trying to stamp out of the game to try and bring down the number of head collisions. There's a lot more red cards in rugby because they're punishing those high tackles and those head collisions more. Contest being imbalanced, but if you diminish the punishment, do you then see players being more reckless again?
What's your sense of that?
I think it's worth trying. I think it's worth, I think often the red card is, I think somewhere in between. I think like an orange card sometimes is appropriate. There are times, and we've kind of gone automatically, Jesus, that's a red card now. And really, was it a red card offence? Did the player deserve to have his game ended for making a fairly basic technical error? But then I completely understand why they're doing it. And the head injury thing is massively important. So I'm as you can probably tell, I'm a bit mixed on it. I'm not sure where I sit. I'd like to see it trialed. I think it's worth trying. You don't want to encourage players to go out and headhunt again. You don't want to see high tackles creep back in more. But at the same time, players are like, if you want the sporting contest to be pretty good, you're trying to sell a product here as well. So,
I guess they want to get away from, as you said, the Peter O'Mahony early sending off, and everybody saying, "Oh God, the game's ruined." The game, this game is
which
gone.
It wasn't. Like, it was an absolute. That was
ironically, it turned out to be okay. You would like to think individuals would still be so loath to be sent off themselves personally, whatever about the team having a replacement in 20 minutes, that they won't do anything stupid. I mean, I guess where the trial would fail is if we saw marquee players being targeted because opposition teams were happy enough to ride those 20 minutes out.
Yeah, and I don't think that happens really. And I presume you'll still get a ban at the end of it all anyway. And Bundy Aki is going to miss the 3 games, the 3 interpros over the next 3 weeks because he got sent off against England.
Yeah. So
that's a serious punishment.
Yeah.
He won't have played for 2.5 months by the time he actually comes back. That's a lot of games to miss. So I'm willing to see what it's like before I cast judgment. But there is the risk that if you undermine the punishment, the spirit of things is kind of taken away, and the last thing we need is more head injuries in rugby. Yeah,
the captain's challenge. I guess we'll see how that go. More stop-start, I suspect, is people's worry. And then will the held-up try have a big influence on things?
Well, I think it'll influence the way teams attack, because I think we've seen a lot of teams pounding on the line recently and kind of taking quick taps and that kind of 20 phases on the line. Leinster and Exeter in particular are quite big proponents of it. And if you don't, like, the kind of reward for getting over the line and being held up is a 5-meter scrum, which is another chance to attack, whereas this is going to be, you'll get the ball back again. It's going to be a kick out from your own line. And that, I suppose, creates a kind of counter-attacking opportunity. This has been trialled in Australia. I've seen it once or twice in the Australian Super Rugby. It's not bad. I think it will change some behaviours, but I think this, like with these things, there's always a lot of unintended consequences. I think we'll see over the next couple of weeks whether this is a good idea or a bad idea. I think you need to see it, but I think they're trying to limit the amount of scrums. But if, say, you're Leinster and you've got a really, really good scrum, it probably takes away one of you to improve your counter-attack from those kick-offs.
So Ireland at the weekend, heavily beaten by France. There's certainly a gulf there. The word reality check was used by a lot of people. They have Italy this weekend to, I guess, finish third in the championship. Fiona Steed was pretty positive, I thought, on Monday's show in terms of the work being done at grassroots level, and was very confident that, in 5-10 years' time, we'll have an international side largely made up of players who have played the game since underage level, which is where we need to get to very, very quickly. What's your sense broadly of the development of the women's game in this country at the moment? And I know that is a very broad question to ask you, but she was surprisingly positive.
I was very encouraged by what Fiona said, because Fiona, as she said herself, is very willing to be critical when it needs to be. And it was interesting to hear her talk about she's obviously working herself, or volunteering at Munster and part of the team there. And I know before the pandemic they unveiled a fairly experienced coaching setup at the top level to kind of run their team. And I spoke to Dorothy Wall before the France game, and I think where the gap is at the moment, maybe the IRFU have said, like, our focus is on growing the player base, and that's great to hear that on the ground in Munster and in clubs around Munster, and I presume in the other provinces as well, they are getting more girls playing rugby who will eventually become women playing rugby. Some of them will be good enough to go on and play at the top level. Others will just play for fun. And there's two different challenges there. What you need to do is then create a pathway for those girls who are good enough to get to the top level. And I interviewed Dorothy Wall last week before the France game, who is one of those players who took up the game at 16, having been a British basketball player. Her father hurled and played football for Tipperary. Her mother was in equestrian sport. She has incredible athleticism from her parents, and they recognised that straight away. And she was fast-tracked from playing for Fethard, her local club, into the Munster system almost straight away. Was playing sevens for Ireland within two or 3 years. And once you're in the sevens program, you are basically an elite athlete. You're looked after. You're doing really good S&C, and you can see from her that she is built to play this game, and she's done the work, and she talked about that. But if you're not falling into the sevens athletic profile of being basically fast, big, strong, fast, and you're, say, a tight head prop, which is where Ireland fell down at the weekend, I don't know where you go to develop to that level, because there is no academy structure. There's no one like I think it's the Rugby Academy Ireland is a private kind of academy for young boys and girls run out of Kildare by a couple of coaches. I think Johnny Murphy's involved and Dan Van Ziel. And they set up an under-20s team privately last year for the women, because there's no IRFU don't have an under-20 women's team. There's no Leinster Academy for women or sub-academy, in the same way that a young boy of promise at 16, 17 would know that he could go to UCD and sub-academy and hopefully then go on to the Leinster Academy. There's a clear pathway. That doesn't exist in for non-sevens women's players, as far as I'm aware. And if you are, say, a tight head prop or a loose head prop who's not quite built for sevens, which I'm someone who wasn't built for sevens at all, at no pace whatsoever. I don't know, like, you're basically going to go into the AIL, and we heard it yesterday, people don't really, the Ireland coach doesn't really know who runs the AIL. The AIL is very much part of the amateur game, and is run by the clubs themselves with the IRFU. So it's not an elite pathway, but now if you shine in that, you'll get brought into the kind of more elite thing. But there's a much bigger gap between being a good 18-year-old rugby player in Ireland if you're a girl than there is for a boy, and I think that's where, like, academies cost money, all this costs money, and the only place you're going to get money is by taking it from the men's game. And some people will find that unpalatable, but I think the IRFU are going to have to take some unpalatable decisions in the next couple of years to find money from the men's budget and put it into the women's budget, because they're under a bit of pressure to do it now, because the women's team, between the 2020 campaign, if you want more exposure on your sport, you're going to bring with it the questions that we're asking here and we're talking about. And the more people like Niamh Briggs, Fiona Steed, Lynn Cantwell, are talking about the game in public, they will shine a light on the areas where there are shortcomings, and you got to have answers for that. You got to have a plan, and as it stands, I don't think the plan is really there to get your 18-year-old girls who are of really high quality into the international team, unless they're sevens players.
Right, okay, that's interesting. You're listening to Rory O'Connor from the Irish Independent. Rugby on Off the Ball is with thanks to Vodafone, sponsors of the Irish Rugby team, Team of Us, everyone in. And on that point about the talented tight head who doesn't have much of a pathway like her male counterpart, as you, I think, rightly say, the Irish public are not going to stand for that much longer. The IRFU are going to have to react to that very, very quickly. Who's actually at IRFU level really looking after this, really advocating on behalf of that 15, 16, 17-year-old tight head prop? Is it Nusafora? I ask, knowing that it's probably not him because he looks after the professional game, and so the women's game doesn't come under professionalism. Is it Anthony Eddy? Is it somebody else? Like, who's driving this forward?
Well, Anthony Eddy is the head of women's rugby and sevens, and he reports into David Nusafora. So this is the kind of grey area within the structure of the IRFU. Certainly when you ask about the men's club game to David Nusafora, he would say, well, that's not my thing. That's Collie McAtee's side of the house. He's tried, that I think comes from the fact that he tried to make the AIL more of an elite competition and got so much resistance from the clubs that he basically went, right, yeah, I'm out of here. I'm just going to focus on what I have. And he even set up this crazy tournament for the provincial A team 2 years ago, where he took most of the best AIL players and brought them to Boston in the middle of the most important part of the AIL season as a bit of an screw you to the clubs. You know, I think there's definitely a barrier there between, there's a disconnect there between the senior men's club game and the professional end of the IRFU. The women's clubs are largely the same. There's a few that are not they're the same clubs, they're different arms of the same clubs, but they are much more important to the senior women's international team than the men's clubs are to the senior men's team, because obviously the professional provinces are have all the players and are controlling them, and they release them to the clubs as they go. So the women's AIL is as I say, Gavin Cummins gave the Irish Times yesterday, asked Adam Griggs, where does who runs the women's AIL? Is it part of the amateur side of the house, which is Collie McAtee, an IRFU staff member, is part of the house? Sorry, I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit. No, or is it under the elite end of things, which is Anthony Eddy's? And Adam Griggs said he didn't know who was in charge of it, which I don't know why he said he didn't know. I don't know if he actually doesn't know, or whether he was just uncomfortable naming names, because he spoke quite well about women going professional in the next decade and all sorts of things. But for whatever reason, he wasn't either wasn't comfortable naming names, or he just didn't know exactly whose house it fell under. But that's a bit alarming, because this is where his players come from. He's the Ireland coach. He's in charge of the Ireland national team, and the AIL is where his players play. They've also played then for the provinces, but that's quite a small tournament that happens once a year. So that's quite worrying. And so, yeah, it falls under Anthony Eddy to answer the question that you asked, who reports into David Nusafora. But David Nusafora is also trying to sign Tadhg Furlong's contract, and he's also trying to deal with the pandemic, and he has a lot on his plate, and that's, you wonder how much attention it's getting. So yeah, and Lynn Campbell, someone like Bernard Chapman, made a big case for her. Like, she's running the South African women's program, and you do wonder how Irish rugby has allowed some of that knowledge, caliber, to go and run a South African program when there's a program to be run here. Yes.
Well, for South Africa to go across the world to headhunt her, and for us not to be using her.
She's under your nose,
Yeah, that's kind of worrying. That's
former Ireland captain,
she would know the scene, she'd know what's going on, she'd know the little pitfalls and the gaps in the system for, as you said, the talented players coming through, all of that stuff. And with the women's game, it's going to be different in different ways, and for a start, you want playing numbers to come up. And we even a couple of weeks ago looked at a report on female participation in sport, and I'm all for you can't see it, you can't be it. But what was very interesting in that study, because they spoke to a really good sample size of teenage girls on sport, is it's actually, counterintuitively, it's not Katie Taylor who inspires them. It's not Bevan Parsons who inspires them, really. It's their mother, their sister, their mates participating that inspires them. So actually a vibrant rugby club in their vicinity with their role models, as in other women in the community, playing the game, having a good time, showing the social side of the game, enjoying themselves, that's far more likely to stoke an interest, it turns out, than Katie Taylor on Sky Sports a couple of times a year, you know? And like a vibrant club game, if they can just get more numbers playing this generation, then the next generation, it kicks on and it grows and it's a good base.
Well, I would say that the women's arm of many rugby clubs now are keeping the rugby clubs going, that the women's arm of the club is often more vibrant than the men's. The men has kind of been beaten down by just people almost feel an obligation to play at times, you know, and the women's game, the teams players who play are excellent volunteers. They're keeping the bars going at times after games, and it's been a real boom for clubs like Old Belvedere, who have a really successful women's team and scene. And like I talked to Anne Conlon, who's the girls coordinator at Ballinasloe Rugby Club, the club where Bavian Parsons came through, and they've got 120 girls playing the game, whereas when Bavian Parsons started, and she's only 19, there was no team. Like hers was the first team started under 14 level in that club. So I think at the grassroots level, there are more girls playing the game. There are clubs and volunteers who are putting an awful lot of time into it. So I think there is growth, and I think there is vibrancy at that level, and I think that can only be a good thing. And you know, part of the IRFU's function as a national governing body is getting people playing the game and enjoying the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other part of it is that they're a lead organisation who have responsibility for the national team. At the moment, the national team is aiming to be the best of the rest in Europe this week, and we don't accept that for the men. Like, the men are aiming to be the best of the best. And there's, as I said last week when I was on with Niamh, and I mean, like, obviously we're two men talking about this, and then, like, I don't claim to be the biggest expert in women's rugby, and this week I'm covering Munster Leinster, but I think there is an obligation on the IRFU to try and have the same standards for the women's team as there is for the men's team.
Yeah.
And it doesn't cost as much money, but it does cost some.
That is the thing. You think what that 500 grand could do for development of the women's game across the country as well.
Yeah, or the money I mean, Brendan O'Brien made the point in the paper review, and I mentioned it in my piece on Monday, they just save roughly 300 grand on CJ Stander. You know, is that just basically gone off the balance sheet because they're broke because of COVID, or does it go into signing Jason Jenkins and Simon Zebo, or could that have gone into, you know, funding an academy for elite girls between the ages of 18 and 21 with a particular emphasis on problem positions? You know, that's a decision. Yeah. And like, most people were delighted to see Simon Zebo come home.
Well, that's the
less
thing,
so with Jason Jenkins, but like, you know.
Yeah. But in 2 or 3 weeks' time, we'll be giving out about, you know, they need to go and get a Zebo, they need to sign people, and then, you know,
bring home Raj. You know, there's competing interests, and like, we can have a podcast on Monday, you know, all about what's wrong with Munster. So I mean, but these are decisions that the IRFU make, and they make them in full knowledge that they will be reviewed in the media, internally and externally, but they are choices. Yeah. They're choices that they're making at the moment.
We've gone way over time, so just to wrap, I know they'll be talking about the Italy game in a lot more depth tomorrow on our Six Nations show coming at you on our social channels. We talked a lot about the performance against France on Monday with Fiona and with Keith. How will Ireland go against Italy?
Well, the game has been switched to Donnybrook because amateur players can't go into 2 weeks of mandatory quarantine. So Italy have played ball, which is very generous of them because they've ceded home advantage, and they're coming over here. Ireland beat Italy in October in that once, you know, it was a Six Nations game, but it was the only game Ireland had in a year, and played very well against them. I think Italy beat them in Italy the previous year, but Ireland, they're at a better, like Saturday, forever about structures and everything. They didn't play well. They didn't fulfill their own potential. They didn't come anywhere near it. And I think they'll be sore about that. So I think they'll play better than that. And if they play to their potential, I think they are better than Italy. Not by a whole lot. So I think it'll be a good game, actually. I think it'll be a lot, you know, there hasn't been many contests in this tournament so far, but I think it's on at 12 o'clock on Saturday. I think it'll be worth tuning into. I think it'll be a good game. Italy have a capacity to cause, I think they drew with France, or they beat France recently enough in the last year or two. Beat Scotland last week, so they're a good team, and what gives it an extra layer of importance is that they're in this World Cup qualifier tournament that's happening, that's even bigger than the Six Nations. It's happening in September, October, as well as Ireland. So it's important that Ireland lay down a marker in this game as well. So I think they will. I think they can win. I think they should win.
Okay, very good. Rory O'Connor of the Irish Independent, thank you so much.
Cheers, Joe.
Wednesday Night Rugby on Off the Ball.
With Vodafone, official sponsors of the Irish rugby team. Team of us, everyone in.